I grew up in New York, um, and it wasn't a musical family, but my parents loved music. My father was born in Israel, and my mother was second generation Russian. And I don't have that many memories of my early childhood, but I vividly remember when I was 5 years old, going with my father to Carnegie Hall and getting the last two tickets in the very, very top balcony to hear Arturo Benedetti Michelangeli play one of his very rare New York recitals. It was the first concert I think that I ever went to. And there was something about that experience that made me decide on the spot that I wanted to be a pianist, or maybe I somehow recognized that I was a pianist. And I remember everything. I remember how it felt in the hall, the anticipation, and then that moment when he walked on stage, very handsome in his white tie and tails. I remember what he played, just the whole experience. And so then I started pestering my parents to get a piano. And finally, on my 6th birthday, they got a little piano for me, and I began. I went through a bunch of teachers very quickly in the beginning that I didn't really like, and then eventually landed on a wonderful pianist and teacher named Edmund Arcus, who had been a student of Madame Levine at Juilliard. And I just loved Edmund. He somehow knew how to handle me and how to develop me. And I stayed with him until I was in my mid-teens when I went to Juilliard Pre-College, where I had Jane Carlson for teacher for 3 years, who taught me a lot about discipline, that I couldn't coast on talent anymore, but I had to play the right notes and the right rhythms with the right sound. And then I went to Juilliard, and afterwards, I went to France for a while and studied with Madame Lefebvre, Yvonne Lefebvre, who was Courtaulds' disciple. And then later, through a Rockefeller grant, I spent 3 years with Leon Fleischer studying privately. I would go down from New York to Baltimore and back every couple of weeks for long lessons. And that was pretty much the end of my formal studying. By then, I was already playing a lot of concerts and won a lot of competitions. And almost all of my teachers, with one glaring exception, impacted me in a very positive way, in ways that I can't always remember because they've become internalized and part of who I am and what kind of musician I am. But the one who I would say was the biggest influence and the last major influence was Leon Fleischer. And he taught me ways to approach music, all music, and to organize rhythms and structure and help me in that transition when I was starting to play a lot of concerts, and how to handle that and how to prepare for that and how to try to do my best during all of that. So, I mean, when people ask me who my major influence is, I have to say Fleischer. And, he sort of put it all together at the end for me. And really, every day, I think of him and am influenced by him in just the way that I play, the way that I understand music. There are 3 elements essentially that comprise music: melody, harmony, and rhythm. And Leon believed, and I believe, that of the 3 of them, rhythm is ultimately the most important, because music exists only in time. It has no tangible, you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it. Yet it's so powerful, but it just goes into us through our ears. there were certain ideas about rhythm that he learned from Schnabel, that have to do with short notes go to longer notes, um, and that helps to organize rhythmic units. Baratam, if you have two 16th notes going to a 16th to a quarter note, um, a lot of people go da da dum. They'll take time before the long note, but there's a direction going to that, and this is so simplistic, the way to describe it, but that's one of his, quite famous ideas, and actually that involves often rephrasing music. So, because composers often will write a phrase or a slur and not go to the end of the phrase, but they go to the downbeat, to the end of the bar. And so often by sort of reorganizing phrasing, you can achieve a tremendous sense of impetus and direction.
Do you have a certain composers or certain music that closest to your heart?
I always joke that there are two kinds of pianists. The pianists that became pianists because they fell in love with Chopin, and then all the other pianists. And certainly, I'm in the camp that probably fell in love with Chopin first, which I think is, rather common. But no, I have Schubert, Beethoven, Brahms, Debussy, Chopin, Liszt. These are some of the composers that I play the most, maybe I'm most associated with. But one of the great joys and privileges of being, a concert pianist and to spend your life involved with the piano repertoire is the vastness of it. And I've always tried. Nobody can play all of it. Certainly I don't, but I try to play a lot of it. And I'm constantly learning new music and falling in love with new pieces. And I'll go through phases. Right now, actually, I'm in a Ravel phase, which is very new for me because I always somehow related much more to Debussy than Ravel. But somehow, suddenly, during this pandemic, I've become very absorbed with Ravel, and I've been learning a bunch of Ravel pieces and studying Ravel. So, and sometimes it's because of recording projects. Sometimes I've been asked to record a certain composer or a certain piece, and then I explore that composer and that piece and fall in love with that. Or sometimes as a concert, a conductor will ask me to play a concerto that I haven't played before, and all of a sudden I'm just completely obsessed with that piece. So I would hate to. I suppose I have, like everyone, I have strengths and weaknesses in terms of repertoire, but I try to play as much music as I can. I'm in love with music.
You have lots of recordings. Do you have a particular one or two or few that you're very satisfied with what you did?
They're all my children, so all of them have some romantic feeling for me. But certainly my first recording, which was an all Liszt recording, was very special because, well, it was my first recording. And at that point in my career, it was a perfect project because I'd been playing a lot of Liszt, and I just won the Liszt competition, and I was associated with Liszt, and so it was a perfect moment to make that recording. But I'm some of them I feel like they have a certain importance in terms of my discography and the piano discography. For example, to have been the only person still to have recorded the complete music of Charles Tomlinson Griffiths, the American composer. That was, I think, an important project, and I had access to the unpublished works and the two piano pieces, so we did everything. And some of them have just been fun. Recordings about, theme recordings. I did, pieces based on birds and pieces based on phantoms and ghosts. And, I loved researching and choosing and recording Scarlatti sonatas. And the two Debussy recordings are important to me because Debussy has always been very important to me. And so I wanted that, it was a chance to make a statement in repertoire that's important to me. I thought it was cool to record all the Bolcom violin sonatas. That was the first recording of those four sonatas. And to work with the composer, and they're all part of my legacy, I suppose. One does one's best in a recording studio, but it's very different than having people there, and and the feeling of performing live for people. That creates a certain connection, an intangible connection, but it's like an electricity that it's very hard to reproduce that in recordings.
How would you approach romantic style as a whole, I guess, but also individual composers, because they're all very uniquely different?
On one level, you could say that most music, not certainly not all music, but most music is romantic or has romantic elements. Bach does, but the romantic period is a period of time that's always attracted me tremendously. When I grew up, I used to read, the novels of Alexandre Dumas and Victor Hugo. Things like The Count of Monte Cristo and, the Three Musketeers, and just all these sort of romantic heroes, Don Quixote, and there's a certain sensibility in the romantic time that is not necessarily relevant or is a little bit lost in our modern technological time. And an emphasis on feelings and emotion, and that being the driving force of creation and of recreation. There's a certain sadness, I think, to Romanticism. If you think about what music, you say something is beautiful, you're not usually talking about music that makes you laugh or jump up and down with excitement. You're usually talking about music that sort of makes you cry. And I relate very much to this, and to the feeling of the individual as sort of a heroic romantic figure, sort of, planting his or her sort of spear in the ground and staking out their territory and saying, this is how I feel, this is who I am, this is who I love, and the love doesn't have to have a happy ending. Sometimes it's easier for me to relate to love that doesn't have a happy ending, whether it's unrequited love or love that's just doesn't ultimately work out. It's that quote, all happy families are all alike, but every unhappy family is its own universe. And for piano, there are, of course, three most dominant romantic composers: Schumann, Chopin, and Liszt. And each of them are very, very different. They all lived at exactly the same time. They were born within a year of each other, 1810 and 1811. Some of them lived longer and some of them shorter, but they knew each other. Their take on Romanticism and music was each extremely personal. And I don't know, I've always had a theory that no pianist plays all three of those composers equally well or relates completely as well to each of them. I think most pianists who, are great pianists for romantic music usually play two of the three better than one of them. And I think it says a lot about the person as to which of them that is. And for me, although there are certain pieces that are very, very important to me and that I love very much, for most of my life, I would say that I related to Schumann the least of those three. There was a certain insanity, a certain craziness, a certain schizophrenia in the music, obsessions with dotted rhythms and certain things that for me were less immediately relatable than Chopin and Liszt. Now, Chopin and Liszt are completely different expressions of Romanticism. Chopin being much more classical in a sense than Liszt, and more it's easier to categorize Chopin than Liszt because Liszt wrote so many more pieces and lived such a longer life and had much more variety of quality with the music. Chopin, with some very early pieces being the exception, almost every single piece he wrote is a masterpiece and was polished and and he was influenced very much by living in France. There's a certain French sensibility to Chopin. There are some composers that, by their nature, allow more latitude in their approach than others. For example, I feel that with Scarlatti, I have much more freedom than I do with Bach. Now, that's not necessarily true, but that's how I feel. I feel with Bach, there's so many musicologists have just beaten us down ad nauseum about you have to do this mordant like this, and you have to use pedal or not use pedal, and you have to do this and you have to do that. And Scarlatti, I feel more like I can do what I want. I feel like he wouldn't have cared if I started a trill above or below in a certain moment, or used a little pedal or didn't use a little pedal. I think his nature was such, he wrote these sonatas for people's pleasure. And I feel with Liszt, there's a lot more latitude because of who he was and how he approached music and how he played himself. And I think, it's okay to make some changes in some pieces and just put a very personal stamp on some of the music. Personality is extremely important in playing Liszt. And Chopin, I think we have to be a little bit more careful to, I wouldn't say respect the text more, but perhaps respect the text a little bit more. There's I don't know. Look, all music is the same in some ways. It all has to be played in a way that brings it to life and communicates its essence and, engages people and moves people and excites people and touches their hearts in some way. Certainly all romantic music is like this. It's hard to talk about the differences in styles between, say, Russian romantic music and and I don't know, Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, etc. I mean, there are differences in sound, and sound is really everything. I mean, sound is what we work with. With Chopin, I think you have to be very careful about balancing the hands. It's Chopin and Mozart. I think are the two composers that you have to be very careful about not overpowering melodies and inner voices with the bass, especially octaves in the bass. Whereas Liszt, you can very often, play with huge bass. Liszt is such a subject. He was a man of the greatest contradictions, who led sort of the quintessential romantic life, was, a symbol of that time. His interest in beauty, his interest in art, in literature, in music of all kinds, championing other composers, transcribing their music, trying to bring it to the world. He was, the first great solo romantic concert pianist, the first pianist to sit up on a stage by himself, turn the piano sideways so that everybody could admire his profile. He invented the very word recital. We can't hear him play, but we can read a lot and hear from his own students. I mean, this was probably the greatest pianist who's ever walked the earth. I mean, his ability to sight read and absorb music, and to touch people and to be free, but yet have great intellectual rigor. This man who was, had the sort of the romantic life of, a rock star, with women, and then at the same time was so devoutly religious, and whose goal was to become a priest. He was, who had such great wealth but lived so simply. Who stopped playing. He's at the height of his career in his 30s. After mid-30s, Liszt never again accepted money for playing in public. He would perform only for a benefit or for his students or certain circumstances, but he gave up that life of touring and of, adulation. He taught. It was important to him to teach, but he never took a penny. If he accepted you as a student, he taught you for free. There are so many things to, if I've always said that if there was one composer that I would have liked to have met, to have dinner with, it would be Liszt, because, you can only imagine this personality and what kind of things you could talk about, and his life and there are very few people that you'd want to, I think, that are as fascinating as a person as they are as an artist, as a composer. So if I can convey a little bit of what his spirit was about, and just touch on the and the scope of his 1,500 piano pieces, not to mention orchestra pieces and choral pieces and organ pieces, and it's just unbelievable what he did in a time when there was no electricity and no computers, and everything by hand, and by candlelight in the nighttime, and it's just unbelievable what Liszt did, and accomplished, and how many people he selflessly promoted and helped.
Wow.
So his life has been a great inspiration to me as a person. There are many, many aspects of his being and his behavior and his attitudes that I think have shaped me a lot, actually. You can talk about, the religious music, you can talk about Hungarian rhapsodies, you can talk about opera fantasies, you can talk about his transcriptions of Schubert Lieder and Beethoven symphonies, and his great masterpieces, the B minor sonata, just there's just so much, and he had such an influence on composers going forward in terms of structure, in terms of impressionism, in terms of atonality. Liszt, threw his javelin far into the future and still has a big effect, I think, on every pianist and most composers alive today.
Always curious that when you play brand new piece of music, you're about to enter that space and learning the notes and the rhythm and you're performing in the near future. What's that process for you?
There's a process that I think every musician on every instrument goes through with a new piece. And if you don't like that process, then you cannot be a musician, I think. So the process is, maybe you hear the music if it's recorded, or you read through it if it's not, and then you start to dissect it. You learn it, you take it apart, you take it hand separately, you finger it, and through the course of your relationship with this piece, those fingerings may change constantly as you suddenly discover a better fingering, or a better redistribution or something. Then you start to be able to play it. At first it's not good, and then you work on it and it gets better, and then it starts to you start to have a sense of the shape of a piece, the architecture of a piece, the pacing and planning of a piece. It's where you're going in a piece. Rachmaninoff used to say that for every movement or every piece, there's a point. And for him, a successful performance was how he got to that point and how he left that point. And that point could be the loudest moment, it could be, the softest moment, it could be anything. But that's how he perceived of the architecture of shaping a movement or a piece. And you start to learn the secrets of the piece. You start to learn the piece maybe better than the composer knew the piece, because the composer, created this piece, but we have to, by the virtue of this process of, taking it apart and putting it together again and thinking about it and memorizing it. And I do believe that we should memorize. There's no question that memory is one of the most difficult and challenging aspects of performing, because there's no performer who hasn't dealt with memory problems or memory slip on stage, struggled to memorize a complicated section. But when you're playing by heart rather than reading the music, I think then you're liberated. You can close your eyes, you can live the music without that process of having to read it, no matter how well you read, and then play it. This is my feeling. If it's a thorny, complicated contemporary piece, okay, fine. Memory is maybe just not worth the amount of time to do. Or, if chamber music, of course, we use the music, although it should be mostly memorized anyway. And memory can be just a huge issue. When you're playing a lot of concerts, because the number of pieces you have to have in your mind, or suddenly you don't have that much time to bring back a piece, and so things happen. It's a challenge, but I think that the greatest performances come when you're playing by memory. Anyway, so there's this process, and you have to enjoy this process. You have to enjoy that process of learning a piece and then playing it. And then there's the first time you play a piece, and it's always it's a little bit frightening, and also a little bit of a mystery the first time you play a piece, because no matter how much you've worked on it, you don't exactly know how it's going to go. It could just be just fantastic. It's just like amazing. It just came out just like, and it's just, but more often than not, there's some place where you realize that, technically it wasn't refined enough, or memory, you don't quite know it well enough, or you didn't hold the movement together successfully enough. And then you play it again and again, and it becomes better and better, and then the piece becomes a part of you. And I feel that for myself, that I don't, quote, own a piece until I've performed it a number of times, put it away, come back to it later and performed it, put it away. Usually the second or even the third time I go through that process, then I feel like, then I own this piece. I know really what I want to do. I'm not concerned with anything technical. I'm not concerned with anything memory. I can just play this piece, and it's the way how it can go. I mean, you can always, of course, and should be discovering new things all the time, but so that's a process that takes time, and and it's hard. It's one of the reasons why students need to have as many opportunities as possible to perform, because they have to go through this process. And I'm jealous of them, of students now. I mean, they can try out their pieces in studio class and for unimportant events and this and that, a number of times until finally, they perform it. I mean, at my stage, very often I have to play a piece for the first time on a big stage, an important place. I wish that wasn't so, and I try to avoid that. I look for tryout concerts for a big piece, but sometimes, I mean, it's the first time I have to play it, and it's always, you never know what's going to happen. You have to love that process, and some people don't love that process. I have a son who's quite brilliant, and of course, like all musicians, I wanted him to be a musician. And so when he was very young, I started him on the piano and the violin, because I thought, well, I should be generous to him and give him a choice. I mean, I personally wanted him to play the violin, but he could be a pianist if he wanted. And, and he did not like that process. Everything, he understands almost anything, no matter how complicated, but he didn't like that process of not being good at something right away. You have to accept that in the beginning, you're not going to be good. You're going to be bad with a new piece. You're discovering it, you're learning it. And he didn't like that. And so he didn't have that nature to be, he liked when he could play something and perform it, that he liked, but he didn't like that process. So he couldn't be a musician. Patience is a very, very important word for a musician. I think for everybody, but certainly for a musician. Things need time, and sometimes you can't impose that time on it. I mean, sometimes it takes the time that it needs, some pieces come very quickly, and some pieces just take time, and you have to be willing to be patient.
How do you take that process to communicate with your students? Because they are all at different places. They're not you.
There was a wonderful singer, songwriter, comedian named Tom Lehrer. And I remember he wrote a song about, I don't remember what it was about, but there was a line in there about this doctor. And the doctor, he specialized in diseases of the rich. And I have always tried to specialize in teaching of the very gifted. For a very talented, gifted young artist, I try to have infinite patience, because I think that their talent demands it. And if I'm going to take them on as, my charge, I have to be patient for them and show them the way. With the gifted students, I mean, one of the things that makes them gifted is qualities that perhaps can't be taught. They have an innate musicality. They have the ability to learn music. They have physically, they have the dexterity and the hands and the ears, and the mind to do this. So, of course, there's a difference between when you take a talented 18-year-old freshman student and a 25-year-old artist diploma student who's already, really a young professional. But I mean, I think a lot of teaching, and this would be true at all levels, I think, one of the qualities that makes a great teacher is the ability to be analytical. You have to analyze what they're doing and help to show them a way to do it better or to solve things that are giving them problems. I mean, there are some virtuoso pianists who don't really know what they're doing. They just play. It's just everything is easy for them. And, although, I mean, I always sort of had the ability to play, difficult virtuoso repertoire, I always sort of knew what I was doing. I was thinking about it. And so from the standpoint of technique, I feel like I understand this very much. I understand when, their posture is hurting them, or their hand position is hurting them, or their fingering isn't helping them, or, the way they're mentally approaching a technical problem isn't good. And, finding always ways, I believe very deeply that you need to always find ways to marry the musical and the technical. That in most cases, the solution for technical problem has a musical solution. They're not just octaves, but they're organized, and if you can think about how you're organizing them, then the problem will go away and it'll be musically better. I think one of the things that makes a gifted musician is the way that they listen. I think that, great musicians listen better than normal people. Maybe they don't listen to everything. I mean, I don't listen most of the time when people talk. I don't listen. But when I hear the sound of a piano, I don't know, it's just something, I just I just can't stop listening to that. I become obsessed. I'm obsessed with the sound of the piano, and I'm obsessed with the quality of sound of piano and how to make it and what it should convey. And I get physically upset if I hear a sound that's ugly, or a sound that's stupid, or it has no purpose. It upsets me. And students always laugh that I'll just I'll shriek, I'll recoil if they make a sound that is not nice, I mean, and so I think that they become, hypersensitive to sound, I mean, not just stylistically, of course. I mean, sound of Brahms is, different than sound of Chopin, but every note, every chord, every the sound of a piece in general, or a moment in the piece, it's just, it's very important to me. I like to I want the students now have to be conversant with more styles than when I was studying. They have to embrace contemporary music, because this is the time that we're living in, and this, we have to. They just have to play new music. I mean, this is not an option for my students. They can choose what they play. They can like, one composer or style more than another. That's fine, of course, but they have to play it. They have to play everything. They have to play chamber music. They have to become well-rounded musicians. And you know, I think I try to also maybe shape them or influence them in personal ways and in psychological ways, in emotional ways. You know, I think to be a teacher is to be a psychologist. You know, every talented person has their own strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and you know, I try to arm them with the weapons to succeed. You know, these are some things that I had to discover for myself. You know, there were things that I got from some teachers that I pass on, and there were some things that I didn't get from teachers, or I see some other people's teaching that I really don't like, you know, and I try to make sure that I try to take care of them. You know, and for most of them, it's a lifelong relationship. Not always, but you know, we're sharing things that are so intimate, things that have to do with, you know, the expression of their innermost feelings and how to communicate them and how to be strong in a profession that is very challenging. Um, and how to live. Not that my life is necessarily an example for them, not at all. But I try to the things that I've learned from my life. I try to teach them in some ways. You know, to be good people, to work hard, to know what they want, to be open to new experiences, to you know all of this. I mean, it's a huge responsibility to take on the the responsibility of guiding a gifted pianist. You know, it's not just showing up for 1 hour a week and you know telling them a few things and you know see you next week. I mean, it's you have to be there for them. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I don't I teach far less than many other people. I mean, part of it is so I can protect my time and practice, and just because I need a lot of time by myself. But part of it is so that I can give them a lot of time, you know, and you know, and this is also a very, very, very important part of my life and also my legacy. You know, some of these great pianists that I've had a hand in shaping, you know, part of me lives on in them.